thank you. Greetings to everyone. I'm glad to all of you are joining us online this afternoon for this Zoom webinar on U.S.-China relations in the wake of COVID-19. I'm Paul Heer, and I'm delighted to have recently joined the Center for the National Interest, where I look forward to contributing to the Center's role in addressing policy issues related to China and the rest of East Asia, and in fact to be doing so in partnership with General Chip Gregson, who I think most of you already know is a fellow at the Center. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to serve as the moderator for our discussion today on behalf of both of us. As we come together today, it's obvious that COVID-19 has profoundly affected all of our lives, including the very nature of this meeting. And the apparent origin of the virus in China has had a profound impact on geopolitics, and especially on the US-China relationship. Most of you, I'm sure, have read a flood of commentary over the past several weeks on these issues and participated, in fact, probably in any number of online discussions like this one. It's been certainly been a fast-moving target, and it's been hard to keep up at the pace of developments and all the analysis of them. But what we wanted to do today was to look beyond the daily news feed on the virus for an hour at least, and to focus some time and attention on some of the longer-term aspects of the equation. And the central theme that we want to address is the prospects for strategic leadership on both sides of the US-China relationship as the COVID crisis runs its course. We know that both sides have been engaged in a contest of narratives about where the responsibility lies for the virus and its spread, and which country is responding to it more effectively. We want to look in part at the personal side of that equation, the perspectives of Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump as the crisis unfolds, whose leadership and prestige might be enhanced by the crisis and whose might be diminished. But more broadly, what we want to really examine today was what this means for Beijing's and Washington's respective efforts to exercise global leadership and on this and on other issues going forward. How is the COVID crisis affecting domestic politics in both countries, and how will this in turn affect their respective international credibility and leverage after the crisis is over? We're happy to report that to help us address these questions, we have with us this afternoon two excellent commentators on China, Richard McGregor and Michael Auslin. Richard is a senior fellow at Australia's Lowy Institute and an award-winning journalist and author. His most recent book was a nice little volume called Xi Jinping, The Backlash. Michael is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and like myself, a historian by training. His most recent book, forthcoming, will be Asia's New Geopolitics. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to recite their full biographies, which were included in the letter of invitation that you received for this seminar. Suffice it to say that they are both highly prolific and widely read and extremely insightful experts on the internal and external politics of China and the rest of East Asia. Before turning it over to them, let me just, to get the discussion started, let me just quickly outline our plan of action here. I'm going to invite Michael and Richard each to give us 5 or so minutes of introductory remarks, and then perhaps generate a bit of discussion between them and General Gregson and myself. But ultimately, we want to invite all the other participants, those of you who are watching online, to contribute to the discussion. Because of the size of the audience, we're not going to be using direct video or audio for all the participants. So if you want to ask a question, and we certainly encourage you to do so, to inject it into the discussion, please use the Q&A icon on the bottom of the screen, of the Zoom screen. And please be succinct, because I think we're going to get a lot of questions. We'll compile the questions, and I will try to inject as many of them into the discussion as I can as time allows. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to turn first to Misha, and afterwards Richard. Misha, the floor is yours.
Paul, thank you very much. Thank you to the Center for hosting yet another outstanding discussion. It's a pleasure always to either be participating or just watching. And I think this is extraordinarily timely because we are at the beginning, I think, of a new era in U.S.-China relations. In fact, I think we are at a fundamental turning point in U.S.-China relations. We've actually been in the midst of a process since President Trump came to office of reassessing U.S.-China relations. I think it would have happened under any president. Hillary Clinton would have done something, but obviously the particular path that was taken was chosen by the president and his team. But we've watched over the past 3 years. It's amazing. We've all forgotten that just a few months ago we were talking about the trade war and whether that would be solved or whether it would go on. No one's probably mentioned that for the last 3 months now. But we were clearly seeing a change in U.S. policy, a change on economics, a change on security in, for example, South China Sea with an increase in freedom of navigation operations. Now, we were seeing very much a change on the influence campaigns, the attempts to call out attempts by China to influence elites or get into organizations or the universities and the like, a different attitude towards cyber espionage and hacking. So all of that was moving us, I think, into a reassessment. And before Corona crisis, certainly I and I'm sure others were calling it the end of the first era of U.S.-China relations, 1979 to 2017 or so. But the coronavirus that started in Wuhan, China, is of a different order. It's of a different magnitude. And I think it's become clear as opposed to 2 months ago, it's become clear over the last weeks and last months, the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party, the party state, is culpable for the mistakes and the mishandling of this crisis in the beginning, quite frankly, of putting the world at risk. If China had lived up to its moral and legal responsibilities to inform the World Health Organization and the like, much of this could have been avoided. And I don't think we're going to turn the clock back. I think that both in the United States and around the world, you're seeing it strongly in Australia, you're seeing it in Europe. Countries are beginning to fundamentally reassess their relationship with, engagement with, and dependence on China. First of all, countries are beginning to understand that you must deal with the Communist Party that you have, not the Communist Party that you want. This is no longer an unknown. It is a known, and we've been dealing with it for years. The nature of the Communist Party does not change. Some of its tools may change, some of its policies may change, but the nature of it does not change. The penchant for secrecy, the penchant for repression and oppression, all of that has been put on full display during the Corona crisis, as we've seen the attempts to squash whistleblowers and cover up the truth and continue to mislead the world. We've seen the opportunism of the party, selling often donated equipment that it received from the world and selling millions of pieces of defective equipment while having hoovered up 2.2 billion pieces of equipment, leaving the world naked in the face of coronavirus. And we have now finally begun to grapple with the great symbol of our age, globalization, and recognizing that globalization can lead to vulnerabilities. It's not what we wanted. It's not what we expected. And by the way, let me just say, a confrontational, oppositional stance between our countries, or in particular the United States, and China is not what we wanted. That was not the basis of 40 years of US policy. That was not the goal of any responsible statesman or administration, but that is where we are because of freely made choices by Beijing and the Communist Party. But to wrap up with this last thought, globalization, we are going to enter a new era of globalization. We're going to have to grapple with our dependencies, not just on medicines and personal protective equipment and the like, but on raw material, on rare earths, raw materials, things that our military depends on China. All of it will be reassessed. Prudence demands this. This is not to punish China. It's not to make it pay. No one's going to make it pay for the coronavirus, so to speak, but it is prudent. It is prudent to protect ourselves. It is prudent to protect the system that we built. And if you care about global governance, as I think we all do, it is prudent in order to save global governance, because we have seen how global governance can all too easily be suborned. We certainly can't go through something like this again. It has the potential of destroying the global economy, not to mention social bonds within our societies. And so we will then begin to reassess the type of relationship we have with China, the degree to which we can trust China, and we will take, I believe, all of us collectively, leadership steps to have a responsible, realistic policy towards China that no longer simply believes everything that Beijing says, but looks at the facts and acts in our best interests. And with that, I will stop that very brief overview and turn it over to my good friend, Richard.
Thank you, Misha. That's great. That gives us a lot to chew on as we move forward. Let's transfer over now to Richard from not exclusively the Australian perspective, but the Chinese perspective, and whatever you'd like to inject into the discussion and perhaps respond to some of Misha's remarks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Centre. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for Misha having me on. You might see the window behind me progressively get lighter as the sun comes up in Sydney. So I always want to talk, I want to talk a little bit first about recent history. I'll talk a little bit about Xi, then I'll talk briefly about the virus. I think in China, we've seen what we might call cycles of hubris. We saw it in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and the Chinese said, well, thanks, we see the weakness in financial capitalism. Our system worked, yours didn't. We saw another cycle of hubris in China in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. You know, the party state styles itself as a meritocracy. They said, well, look at your election. Look what that threw up. That's our system is better. Of course, their view on that changed because I think they were quite destabilized by Mr. Trump and they did not know how to handle that. And so that went off again. I think with the coronavirus and in the current situation we're in, and as we all know, there's a long way to run on this, we're getting another cycle of hubris of the party state. In other words, they say, we got through this, look at the mess of Western democracies. Now, we all know, of course, that line is internally directed as much as it is internally, but nonetheless, it's a powerful message for the Chinese party state to give to their people. Now, we've got this latest cycle of Chinese hubris at a time when China is bigger, I would say stronger, richer. It has a better equipped military. And of course, it has a different leader in Xi Jinping, who compared to his predecessors is more decisive, risk-taking, as we all know, thinks of himself as a man of history, a man of destiny, and is ambitious. He's not just a risk taker externally, we've seen it internally as well. People see him as a disruptor. I would say internally, people see him as more about disruption than continuity. I think it's about continuity through disruption. You know, there's the famous old line from The Leopard, the novel, for everything has to change for everything to remain the same. And I think that's how I see Xi Jinping internally. Very briefly, actually, I won't go into it too much internally because I don't think we've got enough time. But suffice to say that Xi Jinping is under no threat internally, which is not to say he doesn't have a legion of enemies and critics. And I'm happy to talk about that later if I'm called upon. Let's now go to the virus. At the start, we had on full display, as Misha set out, the weaknesses of China, the secrecy, which is a feature, not a bug, of communist systems in China as it was elsewhere, the cover-up, the intimidation of professionals in doctors and journalists and the like. Once the party state sprung into action, though, I think it's important to acknowledge the incredible capacity that they were able to bring to bear on this issue, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with the tactics they used or not, but they're able to mobilize the party, they're able to mobilize the military, they're able to mobilize the tech surveillance system almost overnight. And that goes down from the top in Zhongnanhai and the Politburo right down to every neighborhood committee. This is an astounding display of capacity that China had to do that. And in terms of mobilization, very few countries can do that. Towards when they were getting on top of the problem, in other words, when infections were falling, we saw the astounding conference call of 170,000 officials. Now, I know numbers in China are big and we know shouldn't be befuddled by numbers alone, but their ability to get the message out and to get a grip on the society in the way they did was very interesting to watch, and I'm writing something about that now. Now, obviously, the message, the propaganda message about how the Chinese system worked, as I said, is internally focused. The Chinese people, as many communities around the world have just been through an horrendous experience of residential lockdown for up to 720 million people or so in Wuhan for months, psychologically incredibly difficult. So the party state wants to say, yes, it was worth it. Externally, it's about making gains while the US and Europe are struggling. Just a few more points on that. We are seeing very much very big and noisy fights and debates in the US, in Europe, of course, in Australia as well, as Misha mentioned. But at the same time, China is in great conflict with other countries about how they've handled this, but they've managed to keep those debates quiet. Countries like Russia, South Korea, India, where I think you've got a very anti-Chinese population, but the government moderates its tone. And of course, Iran. Iran was very bitter about how China handled this, but they've since shut up as well. So it's interesting to see the kind of states which China believes are moving into its orbit against the kind of states which are partially or fully pushing back. One other thing I'll say finally, in terms of we're not out of this yet, the big issue in China is the economy. They haven't been through a deep recession really in a big way since 1980. That is going to be a test for the leadership, and I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you, Richard and Misha. That was a tremendous introduction. It gives us, as I said, I mean, between the two presentations, I think we have more than enough to get us through the next hour. I think I will certainly remind people that if you have any questions that you'd like to inject into the discussion, by all means, please do so. We'll be compiling those. There's a little Q&A box or a little icon on the bottom of the screen that opens a window that allows you to type in your question. While we're awaiting some of those to come in, one question occurred to me listening to both Misha and Richard. It's an interesting balance sheet. I mean, Misha talked about how so many countries in the world are reassessing their relationship with China on the basis of the way that the COVID crisis has unfolded so far. And then Richard talked, you made some of the same points. And in fact, I think in that context, you talked about how we're not fully aware of all of the arguments that the Chinese are having with other countries. But at the same time, you talked about the hubris, but then you also talked about the capability of the system to respond to the crisis as the outbreak began. I think, as you know, there was one of the prevailing narratives before COVID broke was that the United States and China were getting into a strategic competition between their respective systems. The Chinese model was being exported. It was competing against the US, the Western liberal international order and model of democracy and capitalism. There were points being scored on both sides. The question is, how has that changed? It sounds like I would take away from, how has the COVID thing fit into that equation? I would take away from both the remarks your projection of a net assessment that the West is still going to come out ahead. Would you agree with that, or how do you think, or is it too early to issue a net assessment judgment as to how this is going to go in terms of the competition?
Well, I can jump in first briefly. I think it's early in the sense that we really don't yet understand the full scope of how our economies and our very integrated economies are going to deal with this. Look, societies do what they need to do to survive. There's no one is going to take a path that is going to willfully or knowingly destroy them. I think that the question of the competition and how it plays into that, who ultimately comes out looking better. I think you're already seeing a little bit of how that's playing out. I mean, if we roll back to January, all the news was how great China was dealing with this, and we didn't have anything to worry about. And then in February, it was, it's a lot worse than we think, but they're still handling it phenomenally. And Richard talked about the ability to mobilize the levers of the state. But what has changed is the understanding that the story that the world was told by China, by Beijing initially, was not the true story. It was not the real story. And now what you wouldn't have even talked about, 2 months ago, people talk about what did this come from research being done in the virological lab set up after SARS, so on and so forth. My point is that there is a new realism, I think, that the crisis has caused people to be able to say things they couldn't say before, which is we didn't really want to grapple with the fact that we sort of knew in our guts in many ways Beijing was not trustworthy, but what were you going to do? You had to deal with it. It was the biggest player in X, Y, and Z. And I think that's what's changing. You can no longer, for your own security and safety, you can no longer take Beijing statements at face value. And I think everyone understands the difference between a messy, open society like the United States, Trump fighting with governors, governors fighting with mayors, mayors fighting with police, and everyone fighting with the populace, versus the top-down approach. I don't think there's a mystery to people as to how democracies are dealing with this, versus they're very uncertain as to what the reality is in China. And I think in the long run, that hurts it. And I think it hurts it in ways that will cause, to one degree or another, a decoupling, whether it's conscious or not, but some level of decoupling that was already maybe happening, but will be exacerbated.
Yeah, I think we want to come back and hope we do to the advisability of decoupling and what the different definitions of that are. But let me turn to Richard. And the one point that I meant to interject on this topic is where are we in the, there's been a lot of commentary in the last couple of weeks about what COVID shows about the relative effectiveness, and I think Richard alluded to this, of autocracies versus democracies. So if you can address it partly in that context as well.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Misha, it's too early to tell. It was only a few months ago that China was on its knees. Now it's running around the world touting victory. There's a lot more wheels to turn before we get to the end of this. It's obviously extremely important for democracies how the US fares in this and how quickly the US recovers, because a strong US is, absolutely an absolute necessity for the rest of the world in managing China. You can see that with the Australian call, for example, for an open, independent inquiry. That's a major initiative for a middle power like Australia to do that, particularly one with such a valuable trading relationship with China. But so far, there's been very few supporters for that. The French and Germans, and to a lesser extent the UK, have basically demurred, saying, well, we're busy fighting this at the moment, we might think about this later. We've seen the pressure that China put on the EU about their statement, which was going to be critical of Chinese disinformation and how they changed that. I think one of the only countries that supported Australia was at the foreign ministry level in New Zealand, Winston Peters, and good on him. But he also added a rider that he'd been assured by the Chinese that if New Zealand supported Australia, they wouldn't be subjected to trade sanctions. So it was a kind of odd level of support. In the long run, the democratic systems should prevail within their own borders on their own terms. But the Chinese system, let's be frank, keeps surprising us for how much it is managed to sustain itself, how much wealth it has managed to generate, its military build-up, and the breadth of that, and even the skill of that. And there are obviously many people on this call who would know far more about that than I would. And the state capacity of China, if they can keep their own people in line, still exceeds what many people thought it would. So we've got a long way to run on this competition.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you partly addressed, both of you. The first question we got is from David Abramson, who asked, and I think we got into this a bit, do you think China will emerge relatively stronger compared to the US and Russia post-COVID? I think you've answered the US side of that equation, but where do you think Russia fits into that equation? terms of the Russia-China relationship, which is commanding so much attention? Either one of you.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on this, but I have been observing this relationship in recent times. You might have seen, I mean, there's always a degree of residual tension between Russia and China for all manner of historical, racial reasons, if you like. Putin and Hu Jintao, Putin and Xi Jinping, they have managed to forge a quite remarkable and productive relationship between their two countries. We saw, though, with the coronavirus, some of those tensions quickly come back to the surface. Russia closing its borders, China's anger at that. The latest outbreak of cases, a cluster of cases in the northeast in China, Suifan, also Harbin, people coming back from Russia and anger about that. So a lot of the tensions did bubble to the surface again, but what interested me is how the governments at the government-to-government level, unlike other conflicts with China, they've managed to keep quiet. So I think with Putin and Xi having such a tight relationship, I think that relationship is intact for the moment. But I think this has been a reminder that it's not all love and peace under the surface.
Misha, did you want to add anything on the Russia side of the equation?
I mean, just broadly, not per se on Russia, but I think it's a fact that affects all nations. Is that, I mean, what you see, and you saw it in Europe almost immediately, is that everyone realized they were on their own. And it's a very different mindset than what we've had with the assumption of liberal internationalism, and that we were all going to be able to work together and get along together. You saw borders, and Richard mentioned, you saw borders going back up. The assumption we have, of course, is that whoever comes up with a vaccine will share it with the world. I feel fairly confident if it's the United States, that'll be the case. If it's the Oxford team, that'll be the case. But China still hasn't let anyone into, Beijing has not let anyone into the Wuhan Institute. There has still not been a CDC team that's been able to get in there. They have not shared the information that they had. We know that they destroyed or basically sequestered the virological samples. So if they come up with a vaccine first, I assume that they would share it with the world. But based on the actions we've seen so far, I'm not 100% positive. And the point again is that this new realism that's emerging on the part of nations. It's a throwback. A throwback to how things have traditionally been. I think in some ways, the coronavirus seems to be putting paid to a very long period of assumptions in international society derived from Western notions about how we are all going to be able to live together. And I think we're going to be going back to much more traditional ways. If you had to hang a sign, I think you'd probably hang a sign that read, Hic sunt dracones. Which means nothing about China. It's the old medieval thing of here be dragons, not Chinese dragons, but dragons. Things that are terrifying and dangerous and that lurk and that you're never quite sure where they are. So you must be on guard. And you must be on guard in ways that we have dropped that guard by letting people fly wherever they want, whenever they want, and never thinking twice about it. I think those days are over, certainly until we get a vaccine. And I think we also have to think carefully about what happens if we don't get a vaccine. There has been no vaccine created yet for a coronavirus. This is one variant of coronavirus. What if we don't get a vaccine? What if we get a vaccine that doesn't last long and we all need boosters? We have to really think about the assumptions we've made about international society as well as domestic society going forward. All of that, I think, hurts Beijing. I think it hurts Beijing's credibility. I think it hurts the image that it has carefully tended for many, many years, because the vast majority of this could have been avoided. And I just feel that can't be stressed enough. It can't be stressed enough. Two things. The vast majority of this could have been avoided, and every single action taken by Beijing was freely chosen. No one forced it to cover up, threaten, mislead. Okay, I just think it's very important that we recognize that, because if our policy, and Paul, you spent your whole career focused on this type of approach. If your policy does not fit the facts and the reality of the counterpart with which you are dealing and or trying to affect in policy, it's a useless policy. I think we're in the era of a new realism. And that goes for everything now, Huawei and everything else.
Actually, I have a question about the new realism. I'll come back to that. On the point you just raised, I mean, we can certainly come back to that too. It's still unclear to me the extent to which the mismanagement, and clearly that's what it was on the CCP side, how much of that was a product of the nature of the system, and a lot of it was, as you say, but how much of it might have been a product of just incompetence and uncertainty and lack of clarity as to what they were dealing with. But I'll set that aside. We have multiple questions coming in now. There's a couple I'm going to fold together here, which essentially get at, how bad might it get in U.S.-China relations, and in what sectors of the relationship? Given James Kitfield asks, given the escalating rhetoric on both sides, and particularly in the United States, how likely do you think it is that actual conflict might develop between the U.S. and China in the years ahead? And related to that, George Beebe asks, might COVID-19 actually trigger a military confrontation between Beijing and Washington? Or is it more likely that the escalation of competition will remain in the economic and informational spheres? It's a question for both of you.
Misha, why don't you go first on US-China?
Yeah, I answered at length before, so I'll try to be brief on this. I think I actually don't think it'll get that much worse, to be quite frank. I also disagree with the assessment, however it came up, that the rhetoric has been worse on our end. I mean, the lies about the U.S. Army creating this, the statement, and this has been, by the way, global. Look at what's happening in France, where the Chinese ambassador or foreign minister, I forget who, but said, they've decided to let the old people die in the nursing homes. I mean, there was a great editorial in Australia over the weekend. Richard will remember, I forget where it was, that it looked at what the ambassador was saying about Australia and the threats, the Chinese ambassador, the threats, and basically said the mask has been ripped off and now we know whom we're dealing with. So first of all, I don't think that the rhetoric has been worse on our side. Secondly, everybody vents and then they walk back. I think the real question is the degree to which it reflects hardened attitudes, as opposed to we're going to just spin ourselves up into a battle. I don't think that's going to happen. And what I think this really is doing is simply exacerbating the geopolitical trends that we were seeing for the last 3 years. It is a black swan, or at least a gray rhino, if you want to put it that way. But it's not that we were all sweetness and light up until January of 2020. The tensions were growing. And to George's point, I don't think that the pandemic will in any way cause a military conflict, but I think we were potentially edging towards that simply because of the actions the Trump administration was taking, the actions China was taking, and the fact that there's always the possibility of a miscalculation and an accident.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, neither the questioner nor I intended to create the impression that we thought the rhetoric was less responsible or harsher on the U.S. side. Richard, did you want to contribute?
Well, I think at the moment, if you look at US and China, I think in some respects, the more unpredictable part of that equation is the US. We know what China wants. We know what they're doing. We know China wants to be the most powerful country in the region, perhaps the world. We know China wants us to internalize their priorities in our own political systems over issues like Taiwan and South China Sea. We know that over time, China would like to push out or marginalize the US in Asia. I might say they would like to do it slowly because they're not nearly in a position to take the US place for all manner of reasons, and we could talk about that. And that's one of the good things about developments in the United States, to sort of bring this forward a little bit. But in any case, the CCP, the party state China, however you want to say it, it's pretty open as to what they're pursuing. As to the US, the system, Pax Americana, so-called, has lasted 70, 75 years since the Second World War. The forward deployment of troops in South Korea, in Japan, places and bases elsewhere in the region, Marines in Darwin and the like. How sustainable is that system, and how can that change or be modified in our interests, and hopefully with China as well? That's very difficult to predict. I mean, I certainly think in parts of China, not immediately, they wouldn't mind having a military skirmish that they would prevail in, be it not with the US, with other countries. There is the opportunity for misadventure, as Misha said, but I think much of this depends on policy and resolve in the US, and what the US decides that it wants, and the American people decide what they want their foreign policy to do. And then that'll be reflected, hopefully, in the White House.
Okay, we have several, a melange of questions here. Since Misha invoked the thought of the new realism, we have a question from Doyle McManus that gets to that point. How would a new realism in the West manifest itself? Resistance to Huawei in Europe, a larger coalition to push back against China in the South China Sea. What would it look like, and how do you anticipate Xi Jinping would respond? Again, for either one of you.
Yeah, briefly, I'll jump in. I think it starts with an attitude change, not to tout things that we've all written, but I had a piece up today at the Spectator that said the world has put an asterisk next to China, and I think that's important. I think that our operating assumption for decades, based out of both hope and belief that things were trending in our direction, was really to accept what Beijing said in a lot of ways, and then we'd often find out later that it was different. And I go through a bunch of that. But if you look now, there's an asterisk appended to China's name. The White House had it on the chart of coronavirus deaths. Real Clear Politics had it on its chart. But the point is that there's an attitude change towards saying, be careful, buyer beware. The truth may be other than what is represented. And I think that is the beginning of new realism, if not the beginning of wisdom. And I think it's very important. Look, the worst thing is for us to always have our expectations dashed or unmet, so that frustration builds and you have a snap back. That's not how we want to have policy either made or executed towards China. So new realism is important so that you're aware of what may be real and how you protect yourself. On the specifics, I think that you see Britain now, there's a big discussion about reversing the Huawei decision. I think you're probably going to see that in other countries, and there's clearly a tug of war between those countries, Italy and Serbia and others that felt they got good treatment by China and others that don't. But if you read the press coming out of Europe, the week the China lost Europe, the week that China lost Europe, things like that coming out, I think you will find, to Doyle's question, more of a willingness of a community not to gang up on China, but recognizing that because of the different scales, you need communities of interest. May I call it a united front, a democratic united front, to face China, because we now understand that these are interlocked problems. That's our out through globalization, is that none of these issues can be or should be separated bilaterally, even if you think of the EU as a unitary actor, so it's bilateral. Instead, it truly is global. We just saw a freedom of navigation operation with our Australian friends. I think you're going to see this reassessment, in no small part, by the way, because people want to keep stability.
I'm not sure I heard the first part of that question, but I think I'll talk about Europe. On the one hand, as Misha said earlier, we've got a trend of, greater national, or not national necessarily, but each state looking after its own, stronger borders, greater self-reliance and the like. But dealing with China still requires a more global or united response. So there's got to be a meeting of the minds somewhere there, that of like-minded countries willing to work together, not ganging up, but pooling their interests and the like in dealing with China. Otherwise, as we've seen in Europe, China quite easily manages to pick one country off against each other. Italy and Serbia, as Misha mentioned, the UK, if the UK does try to reverse the Huawei decision, there's no doubt there's going to be a massive campaign against them. And this is at a time, of course, when their economy is going to be very weak coming out of the coronavirus crisis. They're dealing with the Brexit issue, and there'll be many people inside the UK saying, don't add another weight when we're already carrying a heavy load. You look at France and Germany,
Did we lose
White
Richard?
House is very poor,
Oops, sorry.
and China has made use of that. And of course, German commercial relations with China are very valuable. So I think all those things make it a very difficult proposition. We can all go back into our shells a little bit, but unless we do work together, then I think China really has the upper hand. Even if, I mean, the trust issue that Misha mentions is interesting. How long can people see this kind of behavior from Beijing and just shrug it off and say, well, trade's important, we don't want any more problems, relations with the US are bad. The wheel's got to turn eventually, but China, by that time, could be an even more formidable competitor.
Actually, we have a couple of questions that get directly to that equation, since we're in the global context there in that competition, and on the China versus US side of the equation. Edward Chow's question, isn't it true that the lack of global leadership from the US that we've seen of late, or even interest in global leadership, as some would say, gives China an open field to run that it otherwise wouldn't have? What makes us think we're going to win that contest? And I think that's related to the question from Rosanna Villamore-Vogel, who goes back historically. Kissinger predicted a Cold War between the US and China. Is that what we're facing now? And in this in the bilateral competition, will the US now be able to count on friends and allies and force a choice? How are it's the same question really. How do we think third countries are going to respond in that context? Specifically in the context of the apparent retreat of the US from international leadership and the apparent relative decline of the US, which is not to say irreversible, but I think that's part of the broader context. Either Richard or Misha.
Misha, you should go first. It's not this, you can talk about global leadership for the US, I think, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, look, I think that every country, once the scale and the seriousness, the dangerousness of this became clear, every country immediately and rightfully focused on its own population. I mean, that's what you elect national leaders for. We don't, Donald Trump was not elected, obviously president of the world. Is elected president of the United States. And he can certainly be criticized on what he did in terms of the response at home. I would say that on the global leadership, there's two angles. Everybody, people talk about the G7 wanted to meet and the G7 wanted a statement. I mean, fine, that wouldn't have, a statement from the G7 isn't going to do anything to stop coronavirus. I would say there's two interesting angles to that. First, I would like to think, and we'll never know, that if Beijing had been open, assuming Beijing understood, and we know they did at some point, that this was human-to-human transmission, how dangerous this was, that if we knew that early on, I think everyone would have acted differently, and the US also would have acted differently internationally, rather than working on the assumption for weeks and weeks that this was going to be contained. Secondly, this goes directly, I think, to the globalization question. If you ask, well, what could the US do in terms of global leadership? People will say, well, look at what China's doing. It's donating, even though that's not correct, but it's donating masks and tests and PPE and the like, even though it's actually selling and much of it's defective. The reason the US couldn't do that, so you say, well, then that's what the US should have done. Well, the reason the US couldn't do that is because we don't make any of that anymore. We've outsourced it all. We've offshored it. It all is made in China or other places, except for small amounts here. We could not act in a global leadership capacity, i.e. we were giving the ventilators, which we are doing now, by the way. We were giving masks, we were giving medicines, so on and so forth, because we don't do that anymore. That's the decoupling. Nobody's saying you're not going to get your Nikes made in China or wherever. What we're saying is that critical issues, critical items, medicines, antibiotics, ventilators, now N95 masks, should be made here if we can. If you make it here, you can then give it to other countries. We could have had global leadership or shown global leadership if we hadn't so globalized ourselves that we couldn't be global leaders, if that makes sense. I think that's what's going to change.
Well, I would have thought that at a time, of US-China competition, that it would be a no-brainer for the US to cultivate its allies. The great genius of US post-war leadership is the alliance system. You think about China. China really has no allies except for North Korea. As somebody once said, that's the kind of ally you have once you've run out of enemies. But the US has deep and long-standing relationships in Europe through NATO and bilateral relationships, and of course in Asia, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Thailand as a treaty ally, Singapore as a close partner and the like. And I think unless those alliances are nurtured, respected, and the like, they're going to fray, and over time, I don't know, crumble might not be the right word, but become pretty much irrelevant. And obviously South Korea is the most interesting country in that equation. So I think that's important. If the US wants to compete with China, it has lots of other countries that would like to compete with China alongside them. But they won't last forever because China is working on those muscles very hard.
Thank you for that. Especially your mention of South Korea. Al Song had asked a question specifically about where South Korea and India fit into the equation. Would either of you like to add any few words on the India side?
Well, it was very interesting with India that they actually passed a law. I think I stand corrected, but as I understand it, they passed a law explicitly directed at heading off Chinese foreign investment into the country during this crisis, for fear that it was basically a form of state vulture capitalism. Now, Modi, for example, and the government generally have been quite restrained in their statements, but I think the population itself, for many reasons that you're familiar with in the United States and other countries, in other words, Indian manufacturing not being able to compete with China and thinking that the Chinese compete unfairly, and just their treatment by China generally. So, you know, China has been quite, worked very hard at their top level diplomacy with Modi and Xi, and that is appearing to pay dividends right now because the government, I think, has been a lot tougher than the Indian population on this issue. Oh, sorry, the other way around. The government has been spoken a lot less toughly, or taken a less tough view than the Indian population.
Thank you. Excellent. Richard, I want to come back to you in a minute with an internal China question, but we have a question. We talked about whether there was an escalatory potential between the U.S. and China, but James Kelly has asked a question about the broader region, China within the region. There's been some commentary that what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere is kind of opportunism, trying to score some points. I think that might certainly apply in Hong Kong, you know, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with COVID. But do you see a connection between this and a more aggressive Chinese posture in the South China Sea, increasing the pressure on the other claimants? And in fact, it even applies to what they're doing in the Mekong Delta and toward Taiwan. I guess the general question is, do you see the Chinese trying to take advantage of the opportunity to push its territorial and other claims in the region?
I'll jump in briefly. I actually think it's pretty much a status quo. I mean, which is that the answer is yes, but not necessarily more so because of the pandemic. There might be a very slight uptick, but it's nothing particularly different than what we've seen before. You know, the harassment of Vietnamese ships and Philippine ships. You know, yes, they announced 2 new administrative districts and named 80 different features, but they'd also had created prior administrative districts in the South China Sea. So at one level, I'm sort of surprised that it seems to be business as usual. But then at the other level, it's surprising that, you know what, even in times of a global pandemic, the worst global crisis in a century, it's business as usual. I mean, it just doesn't change the attitudes or actions in Beijing. And quite frankly, it doesn't change the US actions, even though we've sidelined a carrier or so. We've still been doing FONOPs regularly in January, February, March, and I assume April. I haven't checked the April ones, but so we've still been doing all of that. So I think the point is that the geopolitics doesn't take a break. And again, in that sense, what we see from the pandemic is simply an exacerbation of the trends that were developing. The one area I would take a look at, and there was always chatter, not always, but there was chatter about, will Beijing decide to move on Taiwan now because everyone's distracted? I would just say North Korea, the Korean Peninsula is really where to be focused over the next couple weeks. The longer that we don't see Kim Jong-un, and by the way, I'm sorry, I'm just not convinced that satellite photos of his train and his boats means he's alive. That's the first thing I'd start moving around to make people say, oh, look, he's alive, his boats have moved. So I just don't think that's convincing at all, unless we can pick out his roly-poly figure from space and then we say, okay, that's likely him. But the point is, the longer he doesn't show up, clearly something's going on, whether he's dead and they don't know what to do about it now and the fight's going on, or he's incapacitated and they don't know what to do about it. I think that's the real question, where would Beijing try to make a move and take advantage and actually talk about, well, we've got to maintain stability and protect stability by moving in, and the rest of the world is really distracted right now. And on top of that, you would layer South Korea, the parliamentary elections last week. This is the best time. The correlation of forces are better than ever. You have a very left-leaning government and legislature in South Korea, one that may well be ideologically more disposed to something like this, and then the geopolitical implications of that continue to spill on.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with that. I think it's all hands to the wheel all the time, in China, virus or not. In America, I think there was a phrase coined in about 1980 called the permanent campaign, about all politics all the time. I think the CCP is basically the permanent campaign. So they won't be, all the wheels are in motion, and I don't think the coronavirus has put that off. You might think Hong Kong is an exception to that, but I think China had already made clear its tougher position in Hong Kong with the bringing in somebody new to head the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office. And I think that's what you're seeing right now with the various arrests. It might have been a little bit accelerated, but it was going to happen anyway.
I think that's a good segue. I mentioned we had an internal China question. David Sedney asks, and I think this is a very thoughtful question. It gets right back to your book, The Backlash, Richard. David says, earlier this year, there were reports that young people in China were becoming disillusioned about the party's initial response to COVID. But we haven't heard much about that lately. Is there much residual pushback inside China? And the way I was going to frame the same question, I mean, we've, as you say in the book, Xi has certainly created antibodies over the course of his tenure, but we haven't seen any cohesive or coherent resistance that would rise to the level of actual opposition. Could COVID be a catalyst for some move in that direction?
Well, it might have been. It's not looking like that at the moment, but I mean, I think your point is quite right. I mean, there are many people, Xi has many critics amongst the economic technocrats, amongst a wide range of people over the abolition of term limits. He has many critics of the anti-corruption campaign because he's destroyed many powerful families and the like, but there's no ability that I can see for any organized resistance or even organized pushback. We're not talking about a coup here or something, any other coalition of forces which can sort of form an alternative center of power or debate. Certainly not young people, I'm afraid. And the fact that many Chinese cities are opening up now helps. I mean, I certainly think one of the interesting things about this is the brutality of the Chinese quarantine. I think there'll be many more Chinese families wanting to migrate to places like Australia, the US, and Canada and Europe after this. And because of the lack of trust in their government, let alone our lack of trust in the government. But in terms of organized resistance to Xi, I just don't see signs of that. We saw a famous outspoken party member, Mr. Ren, detained and suspended from the party. So they're ready for any signs of pushback, and they are ready to whack it down. I don't think it's quite at the whack-a-mole sense where it builds up and overwhelms them. And I think in that respect, the key will be the economy. If the economy doesn't get going, then I think that's the real thing that spells trouble longer term for Xi.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case, and it remains to be seen the extent to which the economy is going to be one of the side effects of this. I mean, the Chinese have never had to report, what, 7% contraction since the reform period. So I think I would agree with you. There's the vulnerability there. There's one question in terms of China's international leverage, which is connected to several of the things we've said. About the codependence of China on the other countries. I mean, we've seen Chinese playing very creative diplomacy in terms of their export of protective equipment and medical supplies. And given the fact, Mark Episcopus asked this question, given the fact that much of the world's this kind of personal protective equipment and ventilators currently come from China, are the Chinese approaching that as a source of leverage? And could they use it as a source of leverage in trying to shut down, in a sense, or constrain the discussion internationally of the origins of the outbreak or their culpability for it? Would they attempt to do it, use it that way?
I think you have to be very, very careful if you do it that way. That could be a nuclear explosion back at them, that they truly are malevolent actors that can't be trusted. But what they've done is essentially acted that way without making it clear. And I mean by that is that, orders for millions of masks from 3M in particular, and I think there were a few other makers now, and I'm forgetting, whose factories are in China. The Wall Street Journal reported that they were held up by customs issues, customs export issues, and that other PPE, which of course was defective, was also being held up. In essence, what they did was nationalize the production of PPE, again, because we don't make it here. I don't think you can be so crude as to say, well, if you criticize us, we're not going to send you anything. That is a losing strategy for sure. But I think, again, the point about you can't leave yourself and your loved ones at the mercy of whether something's going to get made and shipped out of China is the longer lasting lesson. That's why I think you will see, if not by business choice, then by legislative fiat, some level of decoupling, of that certain things have to be made here. And so there are limits to we always see it in that China has all these different strengths, but there's also constraints on them, and there are limits as to what they can do. And I think that this question of PPE is one of them. And by the way, the PPE diplomacy has really backfired. I mean, Britain had to return all 3.5 million tests. Spain returned tests. Czech returned tests. Everyone's been returning the equipment. The masks are garbage. It has not. I mean, if I were Xi, I'd be very worried about this. That this is actually probably hurting your image more than what people think or don't think they know about what happened in Wuhan. We'll never know. What people do know is that we bought tests and they're crap, and they're not working, and the masks don't work. If I were Xi, that's where I'd really be extremely worried, that China's image of competence is taking massive hits on all sides. Those of us who look at what might have happened in Wuhan will say there were competence issues there, but doctors on the front line and others, they're looking at it from that angle as well.
Okay.
I know we're running out of time. I'll just say very, very quickly, we haven't really got onto decoupling. Obviously, PPE, antibiotics, there's a few things there which are going to be bought onshore in many countries, but that's a really small part of the economy. That's a really small part of trade. Real decoupling means some much, much bigger and more difficult decisions, semiconductors and the like.
Yeah, thank you very much. Richard, it's correct. We have run out of time, unfortunately, and I wasn't able to get to all. There's a few questions left, but we'll have to save those for another time. I was going to invite General Gregson if he had any closing thoughts or comments, or if Misha or Richard have any final points you want to emphasize.
Just one briefly on the geopolitical drama going on behind the coronavirus curtain while everybody's worried about the virus. I'm fascinated by the nature of the system that Xi Jinping has created in China. He's eliminated collective leadership. which means that there's no way to diffuse responsibility when things go wrong, and his economy is declining. That leaves only nationalism as a refuge for him to show his strength and his confidence. And whether it's North Korea, as Misha persuasively argues, or the South China Sea, as James Kelly was poking around about a bit with the question, or some other thing, the temptation to make an advancement on the expansion side, on the geopolitical side, I think for Xi Jinping is pretty strong.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, unless Richard or Nisha had any closing comments. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to all for having us today.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and I want to thank all the other participants who were listening in. I hope you found it worthwhile, and we hope to do it again in short order. Thank you again.